The year was 1882, and the town of Cedar Falls, Kansas, was a place where the wounds of the Civil War still festered like untreated sores, poisoning relationships and perpetuating hatreds that should have died with the Confederacy. It was a community of fewer than 600 souls, most of them struggling to carve out decent lives from the harsh prairie landscape, but all of them bound together by unspoken agreements about who belonged where in the rigid social hierarchy that governed their daily existence. Into this world of carefully maintained divisions came Josh Nathaniel Crawford, a man whose very presence challenged every assumption the good people of Cedar Falls held about what was possible, proper, and permissible in their corner of the post-war American frontier. At 36 years old, Josh Crawford possessed a combination of intelligence, determination, and quiet dignity that had carried him from the cotton fields of Georgia to the ownership of one of the most successful freight businesses in the Kansas Territory. Josh had been born into slavery on a plantation outside Savannah, the son of a house servant and a field hand who had instilled in him an unshakable belief that a man's worth was determined by his character and actions, not by the circumstances of his birth or the color of his skin. When Union forces liberated his family's plantation in 1864, 15-year-old Josh had made a decision that would define the rest of his life. He would prove that former slaves could achieve anything that free-born white men could achieve, if only they were willing to work hard enough and smart enough to overcome the obstacles placed in their path. For 21 years, Josh had pursued that goal with single-minded determination. He had worked as a laborer, a teamster, a buffalo hunter, and eventually as an independent freight contractor, saving every penny he earned and investing his growing capital in wagons, horses, and the kind of reliable business relationships that formed the backbone of commerce in the developing West. By 1882, Crawford Freight Lines operated 12 heavy wagons and employed 18 men, hauling goods between Kansas City and Denver with a reputation for reliability and fair dealing that had made Josh one of the most respected businessmen in the territory. But success in business had not insulated Josh from the harsh realities of racial prejudice that still dominated much of American society. Even in Kansas, a state that had been carved from the national controversy over slavery, a black man's achievements were viewed with suspicion, resentment, and often outright hostility by whites who could not accept the idea that former slaves might be their equals, or in some cases their superiors. It was this ongoing struggle against prejudice that had brought Josh to Cedar Falls on a cold February morning, drawn by news of a debt auction that presented both an opportunity and a test of just how far his success could carry him in a world that remained fundamentally hostile to his ambitions. The subject of the auction was Margaret Elizabeth Thornton, a 43-year-old widow whose husband had died 6 months earlier, leaving her with a mountain of debt and no means of paying it off. Edmund Thornton had been a moderately successful farmer and occasional merchant who had overextended himself in a series of bad investments and crop failures that had gradually consumed his family's resources. When he suffered a fatal heart attack in August 1881, Margaret discovered that her comfortable life had been built on a foundation of unpaid loans and promissory notes that she had no way of honoring. Under Kansas territorial law, when a debtor died without sufficient assets to cover their obligations, their surviving dependents could be bound over to creditors as indentured servants until the debt was satisfied through labor. It was a legal arrangement that echoed the worst aspects of slavery, but one that was still recognized and enforced by courts throughout the frontier, where cash money was scarce and human labor was often the only currency available to settle disputes. Margaret Thornton was, by all accounts, a woman whose beauty had not been entirely diminished by the hardships of frontier life. Tall and slender, with auburn hair and green eyes, she had maintained the refined manners and careful grooming that marked her as a member of the educated class, even as her circumstances had deteriorated. But her refinement was accompanied by attitudes that reflected the worst prejudices of her time and place, particularly regarding the black Americans who had recently gained their freedom and legal equality. Edmund Thornton had been a vocal supporter of the Confederacy during the Civil War, and his widow had inherited not only his debts, but also his virulent hatred of black Americans and his refusal to accept the social changes that Reconstruction had brought to the country. Margaret had been known throughout Cedar Falls for her public statements about the natural inferiority of blacks, her opposition to any form of racial equality, and her frequent declarations that former slaves should be grateful for their freedom and content to remain in positions of servitude and subordination. The announcement that Margaret Thornton would be auctioned as an indentured servant to satisfy her late husband's debts had created considerable interest throughout the region. Several local farmers had expressed interest in acquiring her services, drawn by the combination of her education, her housekeeping skills, and the social prestige that would come from owning a white woman of her background and breeding. What none of them expected was to find themselves competing against a well-dressed black man who arrived in town driving an expensive buggy and accompanied by a lawyer from Topeka. Josh's presence at the auction caused an immediate sensation among the white residents of Cedar Falls, most of whom had never imagined that a former slave would have either the financial resources or the audacity to bid on a white woman's indenture. The initial reaction from the townspeople ranged from shocked disbelief to outraged indignation. Many assumed that Josh was somehow acting as a front for a white buyer who wished to remain anonymous, while others speculated that he was involved in some sort of elaborate joke or confidence scheme designed to disrupt the proceedings. But as word spread that Josh was registered as a legitimate bidder with documented proof of his financial capability, the atmosphere in town grew increasingly tense and hostile. Margaret Thornton's reaction to the news that a black man intended to bid on her indenture was immediate and explosive. When informed of Josh's presence at the auction, she flew into a rage that could be heard throughout the boarding house where she was staying, screaming that she would rather die than submit to ownership by an ignorant Negro who had forgotten his proper place in society. "This is an abomination before God and man," Margaret declared to anyone within earshot, her voice shaking with fury and humiliation. "I am a white woman of good breeding and Christian upbringing. I will not be degraded by becoming the property of some uppity field hand who thinks his money makes him my equal." But despite Margaret's protests and the obvious discomfort of many townspeople, the auction proceeded as scheduled. Kansas territorial law was clear that any person with the financial means to bid could participate in a legal debt auction, regardless of race, and the court-appointed auctioneer was determined to conduct the sale according to proper legal procedures. The auction itself was held in the town square on a bitterly cold February morning that seemed to reflect the icy hostility that pervaded the gathered crowd. Margaret stood on the auction block wearing her finest dress, maintaining her dignity despite the humiliating circumstances, while Josh sat quietly in the front row of bidders, ignoring the hostile stares and whispered threats from the people around him. As the bidding began, it quickly became apparent that Josh was not merely present as a curiosity or to make some sort of political statement. He bid aggressively and intelligently, demonstrating that he understood both the legal implications of the purchase and the value of what was being offered. When other bidders dropped out as the price climbed higher than they had expected, Josh continued to raise his hand, apparently unconcerned by the mounting cost or the increasingly dangerous mood of the crowd. The tension in the square grew palpable as it became clear that Josh was likely to win the auction. Several groups of angry white men gathered at the edges of the crowd, muttering among themselves about what they saw as an intolerable violation of the natural order. There were open threats of violence, suggestions that the auction should be stopped by force, and dark hints about what might happen to any black man who dared to claim ownership of a white woman. But Josh remained calm throughout the proceedings, sitting with his hands folded in his lap and his eyes fixed on the auctioneer. He had not survived and prospered for 21 years by being naive about racial hostility, and he had come to Cedar Falls prepared for exactly this kind of reaction. His buggy contained not only the cash necessary to complete any purchase he might make, but also a loaded rifle and ammunition, along with legal documents that established his rights under territorial law. When the final bid was called and the hammer fell, the town square erupted in shocked silence, followed by angry murmurs and threatening gestures. Joshua Nathaniel Crawford had purchased Margaret Thornton's indenture for the sum of $600, making him the legal owner of a woman who had spent her entire adult life proclaiming his racial inferiority and advocating for his continued subjugation. The immediate aftermath of the auction was chaotic and potentially explosive. Margaret collapsed in horror at the realization of what had happened, while several groups of white men advanced toward Josh with obvious violent intent. The situation was diffused only by the arrival of the territorial marshal and 2 deputies, who made it clear that they would enforce the law regardless of their personal feelings about the outcome. But the real shock came not from Josh's successful bid, but from what he did next. Instead of claiming immediate possession of his purchase and asserting his legal rights as Margaret's owner, Josh approached the distraught woman with a combination of dignity and compassion that surprised everyone present, including Margaret herself. "Mrs. Thornton," Josh said quietly, removing his hat in a gesture of respect that contrasted sharply with her expectations, "I know this situation is difficult for you, and I want you to understand that I have no intention of treating you as property or demanding anything from you that would compromise your dignity as a human being." Margaret stared at him in confusion, her mind struggling to reconcile this courteous treatment with everything she believed about black men and their supposedly savage nature. "What do you want from me?" she managed to whisper. "I want to offer you a choice," Josh replied. "You can come to work for me as a paid employee, with decent wages, respectable living conditions, and the freedom to leave whenever you choose. Or if you prefer, I'll sign papers immediately transferring your indenture to any white family in this town who's willing to treat you fairly and pay you a living wage." The offer was unprecedented in the post-Civil War frontier, where debt auctions typically resulted in years of unpaid labor under conditions that differed from slavery only in their legal terminology. Never before had anyone purchased an indenture only to immediately offer the indentured person a choice about their own fate. Margaret's initial response was to reject Josh's offer with the same venomous hatred she had displayed throughout the proceedings. The idea of working for a black man, even under the generous conditions he had described, was so repugnant to her deeply ingrained prejudices that she could not consider it rationally. "I would rather starve than work for you," she declared, her voice filled with contempt and rage. "You may have bought my debt, but you will never buy my respect or my submission to your authority." Josh nodded calmly, as if he had expected exactly this response. "I understand your feelings, Mrs. Thornton, and I respect your right to choose. I'll give you 3 days to find someone else who's willing to take over your indenture under the conditions I've described. If you can't find anyone, then we'll discuss other arrangements." Over the following 3 days, Margaret Thornton discovered the harsh reality of her situation. Despite the sympathy that many white residents of Cedar Falls felt for her plight, none of them were willing to pay $600 to purchase her indenture, especially with the additional requirement that they provide fair wages and decent treatment. The same people who had expressed outrage at the idea of a black man owning a white woman suddenly found excuses to avoid taking on the financial responsibility themselves. More troubling for Margaret was the gradual realization that Josh Crawford was not the ignorant field hand she had expected him to be. Through conversations with townspeople who had dealt with him in business, she learned that he was widely respected for his intelligence, honesty, and fair dealing. His freight company employed both white and black workers, all of whom spoke highly of his character and his treatment of his employees. When the 3-day deadline expired and no alternative arrangements had been made, Margaret found herself face to face with a choice that challenged every assumption she had held about race, class, and her own place in society. She could continue to resist and face the uncertainty of what other arrangements Josh might make for satisfying her debt, or she could accept his offer of employment under conditions that were more generous than anything she was likely to find elsewhere. The decision that Margaret finally made surprised everyone, including herself. On the 4th morning after the auction, she appeared at Josh's freight yard, wearing a simple work dress and carrying a small bag containing her few possessions. "Mr. Crawford," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, "I would like to accept your offer of employment if it's still available." Josh looked at her with the same quiet dignity he had shown throughout their previous encounters. "It's still available, Mrs. Thornton. Let me show you to your quarters and explain what your duties will be." The living arrangements that Josh had prepared for Margaret reflected the same consideration and respect that had characterized all of his dealings with her. Rather than housing her with his other employees or treating her as a servant, he had furnished a small but comfortable cabin on his property that provided privacy and independence, while keeping her close enough to fulfill her work obligations. Margaret's duties were primarily clerical and administrative, maintaining the books for the freight business, handling correspondence with clients and suppliers, and managing the complex logistics of scheduling wagon routes across the challenging terrain of the Kansas Territory. It was work that made use of her education and intelligence while providing her with a sense of purpose and accomplishment that she had not experienced since her husband's death. But the most remarkable aspect of Margaret's new situation was Josh's consistent treatment of her as a valued employee rather than as property or a subordinate. He consulted with her on business decisions, listened to her suggestions for improving operations, and gradually gave her increasing responsibility for managing the day-to-day affairs of the company. More importantly, Josh never mentioned the circumstances that had brought them together or made any reference to the debt that legally bound her to him. He paid her a fair wage, provided her with good food and comfortable lodging, and treated her with the same respect and courtesy that he showed to all of his employees, regardless of their race or background. The transformation in Margaret's attitudes and behavior was gradual but unmistakable. Working closely with Josh on a daily basis, she was forced to confront the reality that everything she had believed about black intellectual inferiority was simply wrong. Josh was not only more intelligent and better educated than most of the white men she had known, but he was also more principled, more fair-minded, and more genuinely Christian in his behavior than many people who made loud public displays of their religious faith. Even more challenging to Margaret's prejudices was her observation of how Josh treated his other employees, both white and black. He paid fair wages to everyone, provided safe working conditions, and made decisions based on merit and performance rather than race or personal favoritism. The black and white workers in his freight yard worked side by side as equals, sharing responsibilities and respecting each other's contributions to the success of the business. As months passed and Margaret continued to work for Josh, she found herself developing not only respect for his abilities, but genuine affection for his character. He was unfailingly kind to her, patient with her mistakes as she learned the freight business, and protective of her reputation in a community that continued to view their arrangement with suspicion and hostility. The turning point in their relationship came during a crisis that tested both of their characters and demonstrated the depth of the changes that had occurred in Margaret's heart and mind. A group of local men, led by some of Margaret's former neighbors, decided to rescue her from what they viewed as an unnatural and degrading situation by forcing Josh to sell her indenture to a white family. The confrontation took place on a Saturday evening when Josh was working late in his office, and Margaret was helping him prepare invoices for the following week's shipments. A dozen armed men surrounded the freight yard and demanded that Josh release Margaret immediately or face the consequences of their displeasure. "You've had your fun with this situation," declared their leader, a farmer named Bill Hawkins, who had been one of Margaret's husband's closest friends. "But enough is enough. No white woman should be forced to work for a Negro, especially not a lady of Mrs. Thornton's breeding and background." Josh emerged from his office to face the armed men, his own rifle held casually but purposefully in his hands. "Mrs. Thornton is free to leave any time she chooses," he said calmly. "Her staying here is her decision, not mine." "That's a lie," Hawkins replied angrily. "You own her debt, which means you own her. We're here to make you a fair offer to transfer that ownership to people who'll treat her properly." It was at this crucial moment that Margaret made a decision that shocked everyone present, including Josh himself. Instead of remaining safely inside the office, she stepped out to stand beside Josh, facing the armed men with a courage that surprised even herself. "Mr. Hawkins," she said, her voice clear and strong, "I appreciate your concern for my welfare, but I must tell you that you're mistaken about my situation. Mr. Crawford has treated me with more respect and kindness than I have any right to expect, and I have no desire to leave his employment." The men stared at her in disbelief, unable to comprehend how a white woman could voluntarily choose to remain in the service of a black man. "Margaret, you don't know what you're saying," Hawkins insisted. "This man has done something to your mind, confused you somehow. Come with us now, and we'll see that you're properly cared for." Margaret's response was delivered with a dignity and conviction that left no room for misunderstanding. "I know exactly what I'm saying, and I'm saying it of my own free will. Mr. Crawford has never shown me anything but courtesy and respect. He has given me meaningful work, fair wages, and the opportunity to rebuild my life after my husband's death. I will not leave unless he asks me to go." The confrontation ended without violence, but the incident marked a turning point in how both the community and Margaret herself viewed her relationship with Josh. For the townspeople of Cedar Falls, the sight of a white woman voluntarily defending a black man challenged fundamental assumptions about race and power that many found impossible to accept. For Margaret, the moment of standing beside Josh against the hostility of her former friends represented a complete transformation of her understanding of herself and her place in the world. She had discovered that dignity, respect, and genuine human worth had nothing to do with the color of one's skin and everything to do with the content of one's character. Over the following years, as Crawford Freight Lines continued to grow and prosper, under the joint management of Josh and Margaret, their partnership became legendary throughout the Kansas Territory. Margaret's intelligence and organizational skills complemented Josh's business acumen and knowledge of frontier conditions, creating one of the most successful transportation companies in the region. More importantly, their working relationship gradually evolved into something deeper and more meaningful. A friendship based on mutual respect, shared values, and genuine affection that transcended the racial boundaries that had once seemed impossible to cross. When Margaret's period of indenture officially ended after 3 years, Josh offered her a full partnership in the business, making her an equal owner rather than an employee. Her acceptance of this offer formalized a relationship that had already become the foundation of both their lives. Years later, when a newspaper reporter asked Margaret how she felt about working for the man who had once owned her debt, her response would be quoted throughout the country. "Mr. Crawford never owned me. He freed me. He freed me from ignorance, from hatred, and from the prison of my own prejudices. I'm grateful every day for the opportunity to work beside the finest man I have ever known." The story of Josh Crawford and Margaret Thornton became a powerful example of how understanding and respect could overcome even the deepest divisions between people, proving that the human capacity for growth and change was stronger than the forces of hatred and prejudice that sought to keep Americans divided by race and class. And in the office of Crawford Freight Lines, where a former slave and a former Confederate sympathizer worked side by side to build something lasting and meaningful, visitors could see the proof that America's promise of equality and opportunity was not just a political slogan, but a living reality that could be achieved by anyone willing to judge others by the content of their character rather than the color of their skin.